Hey, everybody. This is the second part of the second lecture. And before you watch this one, make sure to watch part one. So in the second part of the lecture, we're going to talk a little bit about the American Revolution. And this is not so that you're end up as experts in the Revolutionary War, but just so that we highlight some of the places in New York where some key events happened during this critical moment in the city's history and in the country's history. So you'll recall from part one of this lecture, we looked at the Montresor Plan, and you will further recall that there was a public space on the north side of New York City at that point, which was called the Common, which is today's City Hall Park. And the Common was the main gathering place in town, and it was it became the main gathering place of revolutionaries during the lead up to the war. So the Sons of Liberty were one of these groups of rebels who would meet there, and they would get into arguments with the soldiers who were British soldiers who were stationed there. So the Common became this really contentious area. And when the Declaration of Independence was written in 1776, it took a few days to reach New York. And when it did get there a couple of days later, so it wasn't July 4th, but on July 6th, it was posted around town as like a broadside. And Washington, who wasn't George Washington, that is, who was in charge of the Continental troops and who had come there from Boston, assuming that the British were going to invade New York City. He had someone read the Declaration of Independence out loud to his troops assembled at the Common. So 3 days later, a group of soldiers and sailors who were sympathetic to the revolutionary cause gathered in Bowling Green. Bowling Green is the little triangle of space at the foot of Broadway that we looked at. Hello? Sorry. So a crowd of soldiers and sailors gathered in Bowling Green, and they were riled up from hearing the Declaration of Independence. And there you can see Bowling Green. So they marched down Broadway, gathered at Bowling Green, and they did something that was really sacrilegious to the British. There was a statue of King George III that had been placed in the middle of Bowling Green 5 years earlier. And the soldiers and sailors threw ropes around it and brought it crashing to the ground. And it was made out of, it was gilded lead. So they sent it to they hacked it up into pieces and sent it to a forge in Connecticut, where they manufactured bullets out of the lead to use on the British. So that happened in Bowling Green on July 9th, 1776. The fence is still there if you go there today. This wrought iron fence. Apparently, the original fence that was there when they took down that statue, and if you go there, originally the fence, every once in a while originally would have had a crown up here, like a little iron crown for the king, you know. And so in addition to destroying the statue, they also went around and they cut off all the crowns from the top of the fence. And if you go there today, you can still feel that the tops right here are jagged from where those were broken off. There's some thought that the fence around Bowling Green is the earliest surviving example of anything in the built environment in New York City. The oldest remnant of something that somebody actually built, which kind of tells you that New York City is really not that old. I mean, there's not a lot of stuff doesn't really last in New York the way it does in other places like Rome and Paris. So that was in July, and then in August, after the British Navy had arrived and camped off on Staten Island, they landed their troops in Brooklyn, and then Washington brought his troops over to meet them, and this became the Battle of Brooklyn, which was a disastrous defeat for Washington. So that happened on August 27th. And so one of the maps from the reading, this is the Hayden campaign map from 1776. So this is one of the maps that you're looking at. And yeah, sorry, the Faden campaign map. I said Hayden, Faden campaign map. Oh, so I wanted to just show you that. So this map is showing the events of the Battle of Brooklyn. Oops. So what you see here are the various lines of battle and the roads that the troops took. And then their retreat across the East River when Washington lost. Again, I don't need you to know all about the strategy and outcome of these battles and stuff, but it's interesting to look just at the terrain of Brooklyn at that time. Here is that ridge of land that's a remnant of the terminal moraine. And you can see that the battle was waged over those hills back and forth. And you can also see that Brooklyn at the time, and we're going to talk about this much later in the course when we talk about Brooklyn's history, it was a series of disconnected villages connected by rural highways and farmland. So, so that was what Brooklyn was like at that point. And then also Manhattan, this is the city of New York down here, which is where originally New Amsterdam was. And the rest of the island at that point is also a series of villages. Here's one village here called Kips Bay. Here's another one called Bloomingdale. And there were rural highways. This is the Bloomingdale Road, which ended up becoming part of modern day Broadway. And this is the road to Greenwich. Anyway, and most of Manhattan was farmland at that point. Likewise in Queens, you can see there's villages. Here's Flushing, here's Newtown, here's Bushwick. That's actually part of Brooklyn. So it was a rural landscape. It was farming, and that's this was a major battle in the Revolutionary War, and that's the terrain that they were grappling with. So, so Washington and his troops are defeated in the Battle of Brooklyn. They narrowly escape across the river at nighttime back to New York, and then they retreat up the Bloomingdale Road as fast as they can. Here you can see the British ships here about to land, and they go all the way up to today's Washington Heights, named after Washington, which was the highest point in Manhattan. And there was a fort that they had built there called Fort Washington, which I'll show you on another map in a second. And there's a mansion up there that's still there today called the Morris Jumel Mansion. And Washington took that over as his headquarters. And they abandoned the city of New York to the British. So the British invade. And then on September 20th, Washington is looking south from his headquarters down to the tip of the island, and watches New York City burn down, or about a quarter of the city burnt down. So this completely changed the course of the city. I mean, obviously, this was a devastating fire. 1/4 of the city completely destroyed. And the firefighting techniques at this point were really archaic. This is well before steam engines were used in fighting fire. And the only way to fight fire was they would do one of two things, or they would do two things. They had fire pumps. Here you can see a guy directing a stream of water at a house, and they had to be manually pumped, which you can see here. These guys are pumping it. It's like a lever, like a teeter-totter, going back and forth to get up enough pressure. And then these people here are taking water from a well and dumping it into the engine for a water supply. So it was very crude. The other thing that they could do is they could form a bucket brigade, and they could ferry water from the rivers, from the East River or the Hudson River, and just get water that way. And, buildings weren't very tall at this point. So if a building caught on fire, this worked okay. But if the entire city caught on fire, not so much. So here's St. Paul's Chapel, which at that point was 10 years old, just right next to the Commons on Broadway. And this is still there today, and is now one of the oldest buildings in Manhattan. But at the time, it was the new church, and it was saved in the Great Fire of 1776 because soldiers, British soldiers, and locals who were still in town after Washington evacuated, formed a bucket brigade to the Hudson River, which is nearby, and they managed to wet down the roof. And some people got up on the roof, and if any embers fell on the roof, they would quickly beat them out with sacks, and they were able to save the church. But Trinity Church, just to the south, was not so lucky. Trinity Church was completely destroyed by fire, and it remained a ruin throughout the rest of the war until 1790, when it was rebuilt. So for a long time, it was just a ruin on Broadway. So one of the maps you're looking at is called the Samuel Holland map from 1776. And this map is really interesting, well, for a couple of reasons. It shows what's going on in Brooklyn in a lot of detail. So let's start it with Brooklyn at first. And here you can see that this was the main ferry landing in Brooklyn. And then here's the road that goes to Flatbush, right here. You can see this is up on a hill. This area became much later, much later, became Brooklyn Heights, a neighborhood called Brooklyn Heights, which we'll look at in some detail later in the semester. This is 1776 though, and so Washington and the Continental Army built this fort called Fort Sterling so that they could commandeer this part of the river. That didn't work. That was completely useless in the Battle of Brooklyn. Because why, you ask? Because the British Navy just sailed right past it. So that was worthless. But then the British took it over and used it. And then there was a series of rural highways going this way and that. You can see this is all swampland down here. This is modern day Red Hook in Brooklyn. And then this is Governor's Island here. So you can see there's a fort on Governor's Island as well. And this is, so let's look at downtown Manhattan. So this is the remnants. This is Fort George. And this is the built up part of the city up to about here, you know, something like that. That part had been developed. The rest of it out here was farmland. Here you can see the Bowery, which we looked at on the Montresor plan, going to the north. Here you can see Lispenard's Meadows, right here. This drawing is getting a little out of control. Let me do some erasing. So the fire, the Great Fire of 1776 was one of many so-called great fires that destroyed big parts of the city. One reason that we don't have a lot of architecture left from the colonial period is that because of these great fires, just a lot of stuff just didn't survive. Another reason we don't have a lot of stuff from the colonial era is just because New York has always been about progress and development. And until the 1960s, when landmarks preservation laws were passed, there was very little sentiment about old buildings. And so things were torn down that probably would be saved today. So there was the Great Fire of 1776. There was a big fire in 1811. The other really big one was 1835, which we'll talk about later, that had major repercussions for the development of the city. 1835, and then there was one in 1845. So the later 1835 fire burned like something like this whole part of the city, something like that. And then the 1845 fire burned something like this part of the city. And 1776, you can see where it was because it's clearly shown on the Samuel Holland map. So the fire started in a tavern down here at the edge of the harbor. It was a windy night, as fate would have it. There's an account that I've read of a prisoner who was being held in a ship somewhere out here in the harbor. And he saw this happen at night. He said it looked like several fires were started at the same time. From where he was watching, he saw the fire down here, and then he also saw Trinity Church catch on fire. And so that his account, plus a lot of other eyewitness accounts, led the British to assume that it had been started by somebody in Washington's army. And it's very possible that it was. So strategically, like, why would Washington burn down the city? Well, you could say, well, he was from Virginia and he didn't care about New York. And there may have been part of that, but strategically, he had just given up the city and the British had taken over. And that was a huge deal for the British to have control of New York City, because by controlling New York City, they controlled access to the Hudson River. What the British were trying, this is probably too much detail, but what the British were trying to do is cut off New England from the rest of the colonies. And they could do that by controlling the Hudson River. So New York City was really critical to their overall strategy of winning the war. So Washington realized that. And so when he was leaving the city, he apparently thought it was not a bad thing for the city to burn, because then the British wouldn't be able to use the city as effectively. They would be left with fewer resources, fewer places to house their troops, etc. So Washington saw the fire happen. He saw it when he was up in Washington Heights. He looked to the south and saw the city on fire. And he wrote a letter, I think it was to his brother, if I'm not mistaken. I could be wrong about that. I think it was to a member of Congress, but he wrote a letter like the next day reporting on the fire, and he kind of hedged about whether it was intentional or not. And he kind of said that like it wasn't necessarily a bad thing, that the city had burned down, because it did leave the British very compromised in their choices, in their ability to safely house their thousands of troops. So the fire, let's get back to the fire. So probably it was either set in several places at the same time, or probably more likely, given how windy it was that night, that what the prisoner on the ship was seeing when he was looking at it was that it started here, but then the wind carried embers north and then dropped down onto Trinity Church and started a fire there as well. Generally speaking, though, the fire, you can see the path in this map because everything that it burned has been erased from the map. So he's showing the intact part of the city here with these red lines around each block. You can see there. I'm talking about the cartographer Samuel Holland. Sorry. So all of this part, this is the part that's blank, is basically showing you where the fire was, the path of the fire. You can see that it destroyed part of the fort, Fort George. And then it just destroyed pretty much everything over here. Here's Trinity Church, which it destroyed. So it took out, it's following Broadway north, took out almost everything on Broadway on the west side of the street. And it was completely out of control. I think it burned for a couple of days. They probably say in the reading. It definitely burned overnight and well into the next day, if not for a couple of days. Completely out of control. The British Army and Navy came in and tried to put it out, but there was only so much they could do beyond saving St. Paul's Chapel, which is right here. And then if you can see this building here, this is part of what at the time was called King's College. It's today's Columbia University. It was originally down here, and so it was kind of apart from town. There wasn't a lot of development around it. And the fire, as it approached Chambers Street right here, gradually just kind of burned itself out. But it was a devastating fire. Again, about a quarter of the city was, approximately a quarter was completely destroyed. So the Samuel Holland map is really interesting because it shows you the path of the fire, and also it shows you a lot of really interesting information about Brooklyn down here, about what it looked like at that point. Really beautifully drawn map. Oh, I should have shown you this before. This is a close-up. So here you can see the path of the fire. There's Trinity. Here's St. Paul's. Here's the Common. Here's Columbia, which was called King's College. Sorry, not Columbia. So all of this stuff here was destroyed. So with so much of the city destroyed, then the British, they occupied the city for the rest of the war. So they took over in 1776. The war doesn't end until 1783. So that whole, 7 years, New York was occupied by British troops and Navy, Army and Navy. And they had to make do. I mean, the one building that King's College had hadn't been destroyed, which is right here. So they used that for barracks. They took the books out of the library, the school library, and burned them to keep warm. Pretty bad. So, I mean, this was in December that the Great Fire happened, so it was really cold. And so they burned books to keep warm. Pretty terrible. And with so few buildings, there weren't enough buildings to house all the troops, so they had to put up tents, and they kind of like lived in the ruins of the buildings. Like they would find a building with 3 intact walls and then put a tarp over it to make a tent. And you can imagine they weren't very pleased with those accommodations, and there was a lot of disease perennially for the British Army. A lot of people died of disease. So New York became really just a horrible, horrible hellhole for the rest of the war. And almost no one else was there other than the British Army and Navy, because everyone else got out, you know. But there were loyalists, British loyalists, who stayed in the city. But most people tried to evacuate. So the population of the city went way down. And it was really just a dreadful place for the rest of the war. So when the war ended, one of the first things that Washington had to do was figure out how to get the city rebuilt. Oh, here's another version. This is older. It's old now, but this is from a 19th century map showing you. This is interesting because it shows has a key and shows you where everything was in more detail, maybe than some of the other maps we've looked at. Probably way too much detail for our purposes, but pretty interesting to look at. And so the fire started, there was a tavern down here somewhere, and it worked its way north. Oh, sorry, here it is. This is the path of the fire. You can see that's in shaded area here. So according to this, yeah, here's King's College. It almost got King's College, but didn't. So it burned itself out. But that's a pretty huge part of the city that was destroyed, you know. Again, here's the Common. We're going to be talking about the Common a lot because it becomes City Hall Park. Pretty important. We're going to talk about that next lecture. This is St. Paul's, which was saved in the fire. Here's Trinity. You can see it was destroyed and not built again until 1790. So this is a view of the devastation in the years after the fire. And I found this on a video game called Assassin's Creed. I believe Assassin's Creed 2. So some of you may have played this. I personally have not. So I don't know really what it involves. I don't know if you just like run around the city or if you try to kill people or what, but if you want to check that out, Assassin's Creed is the name of the video game. And I was kind of impressed by this, at least by the attempt to make it historically accurate. This is showing you a view of Bowling Green. And this is the pedestal of the King George statues, which was left after they pulled down the statue and hacked it up to make bullets. The pedestal was there for years after, and here's the fence, or a fence, around Bowling Green. It's not the same one that's there today. So I'm not sure if they have that right. And this is Broadway here, so you're looking north up Broadway. The only thing about this is that if you look at the Samuel Holland map, it looks like these buildings over here were destroyed. So I'm not sure how accurate that is. But I've only seen this image from Assassin's Creed. I haven't had the pleasure of playing it. So I think at some point, probably I should. Maybe some of you guys can tell me how I might do that. I know nothing about video games whatsoever, except for Minecraft, which my kids are addicted to. But I don't know how I play Assassin's Creed, and I don't know what would happen if I did. But kind of curious. So I already said this. So the war doesn't until 1783. When it ends, the British evacuate New York. Washington rides back triumphantly into the city. And but I'm getting ahead of myself. So for the rest of the war, the British Army and Navy occupied the city. And during those years, they produced more maps. British were really, really good at map making, and had some of the best cartographers in the world at that point. And they produced this map called the British Headquarters Map, which is like what it sounds. It was produced for use by the British Army and Navy during the war. And this was their headquarters. New York was their headquarters. So this map is in sections, and this is in the reading. And if anything, this is even more detailed than the Samuel Holland map. And again, you can see Brooklyn in great detail here. You can see, for instance, how swampy this area is that became Red Hook. That's today's Red Hook. And Red Hook, if you know that neighborhood at all, it's still to this day really, really low, and it's prone to flooding. So during Superstorm Sandy, Red Hook was devastated because it's so low. It's just basically at sea level. So it's prone to flooding, which is, stands to reason since it was originally swamp, not really that long ago. Here's Fort Sterling. You can see, there's a lot to look here. Here's the ferry landing. This is where Washington evacuated his troops in 1776. And you can see the different roads. Here's the road down to Flatbush. You can see that it's mostly farmland with a lot of hills. Some of these hills are still there today, like this one is still there, although it's covered by houses and streets. And then this is showing Manhattan and the same area that was shown in the Montresor plan and the Ratzer plan. This is the built up part of the city. Here's the Bowery going north. So a lot of this stuff, here's Lispenard's Meadows. A lot of it repeats on multiple maps. And then this is the middle part of the island. You can see all the hills and swamps. And, the main thing here, I think the main takeaway here, I think, is that there's this idea that because Manhattan is covered with streets and buildings, that it's flat, and it is absolutely not flat. It's definitely been, we'll talk about this later in a couple lectures, it's definitely been like tortured. It's the valleys have been filled in, the hills have been shaved down, but not all the way. And here you can see that in the 1780s, it was still very hilly. And as it gets north, it gets even more hilly. So this is up by Washington Heights. Here you can see, this is Fort Washington here. This is the modern day Bronx up here. All that's the Bronx, what became the Bronx. At that point, it was just called Westchester. And it's in sections in the reading. So I tried to stitch it together so you can see what it would look like all together. It's an astonishingly detailed map. And this was used by the British in their, planning in their fight against the Continental Army in Washington. So the war finally ends in 1783, and on November 25th, the British surrender the fort and they get on their ships and they leave. They take down the British flag from the fort and they evacuate. And Washington comes back into the city victorious after such a long, hard war, and he rides down Broadway and reclaims the city. And this was called Evacuation Day. And for years, this was a big holiday in New York City. It's kind of fallen by the way. It's completely fallen by the wayside. Nobody remembers Evacuation Day. But if you look at newspapers from 100 years ago, they were still celebrating Evacuation Day every year with parades and banquets and everything. It was a big deal. So the war ends and Washington goes down Broadway, reclaims the fort. And this was a huge deal because, the war was over and now it was the United States of America instead of just the British colonies. And New York was right in the center of everything. Really, really critical to the war. The story was that the British left and they took down their flag, but before they left, they greased the flagpole, supposedly, so that it was harder for the Americans to put up the American flag. So here's a image of Washington coming back into the city victorious, and you can see people throwing flowers at his feet. He was really considered like a godlike figure at that point, and is still considered a great general and a even better president, even though he was, of course, a slave owner, as was his wife. Actually, most of the enslaved people he had belonged to his wife, Martha. So his legacy has been compromised by that, certainly. But he was, at the time, really considered to be like a god, almost, really idolized. And then in the years following the war, we're going to talk more about this. So New York is, for the first time, an American city rather than a British colony, and colonial city, rather. And then it actually became the first American capital, briefly, from 1789 to 1790. Okay, that's the end of part 2. So if you guys want to read more about this, this is an excellent book called 1776 by David McCullough, which is really exciting to read, especially the New York part. And it has a lot of the maps that we've looked at. Here's the Phaidon campaign map, and got other maps that we haven't looked at. It's really exciting. It reads like a novel. It's really great. There's King George. There he is, looking very satisfied. There's George Washington. There's GW himself. Anyway, this is a great book. I think maybe I'll reread it. It's been a while. 1776 by David McCullough. Not required, but if you're interested in more about the American Revolution in New York, you should read that, definitely. Let's see. I think that's about it. I went much faster than I thought I would. Okay, that's part two. Thanks, guys.